Yesterday, we learned how to graph sine graphs, right? Well, 2 days ago, I guess, but you quizzed yesterday. Today we're going to continue with that, but move into cosine graphs, which is pretty much the same exact thing as sine graphs, but just a different pattern which you got to follow. So we still do all the same stuff, just a little different of a pattern. Okay? So as a warm-up, let's practice sine, refresh ourselves on that, identify our three things that we need to know, and then talk about how to graph. Okay? So, in this first example, let's talk about the amp. Remember, the amp is just the number in front of your sine. That's what you're multiplying by. So in this case, that's 2. And the other one that's easy to identify is the midline, which is your vertical shift up, and that is positive 1. All right. And then the last thing you got to identify is what your period is, and it comes from your b value. Okay, it's not 4, but it comes from 4. Right? Remember that your period is equal to 2 pi divided by b, which in this case would be pi over 2. And what that's saying is that you have an entire period, entire wavelength from 0 to pi over 2. Okay? So let's remember how the pattern works. Okay, so you always start by graphing your midline. So I'm going to graph my midline at positive 1. Okay. And then remember that sine is going to start on the midline at 0. Okay? So in this case, I'm going to start right here on the midline, right? And then I always like to say where I finish. So like if my period is pi over 2, then it's going to end at pi over 2. That's one period length, right? And remember, we also said that sine in the middle crosses the midline as well, right? Okay, well then it is it's in between those points that the amp comes in handy, and it starts off by going to its maximum value and then down to its minimum. So between these first 2 points, our amp is 2, so we're going to be going up 2, and between the second 2 points, we're going to be going down 2, and there is our sine graph. Not too bad, right? As far as the quiz or test goes, all you have to do is identify these 3 things and graph one cycle, and then life is good. Okay, but today's lesson is on graphing cosine now, which follows the same exact stuff, but we'll just do a new pattern. Okay, so you can graph this in your calculator and notice that it looks pretty similar to sine, but it just starts at a different spot. Okay, so here's our basic cosine graph. We're going to identify the same 3 things we always have. The amplitude is still 1 in this case. The midline is 0, so you saw that when we looked at the sine graph earlier. And our period is, because b is 1, our period is just 2 pi. Okay, so it's just your parent function for cosine. So let's look at how that works. I still start by graphing the midline first. Okay, so there's my midline. But here's the difference. Okay, so the sine graph starts and ends on the midline. The cosine graph starts and ends at either a max or min. If it's positive, it's going to start and end at a max. If it's negative, it's going to start and end at a minimum. Okay? So this is what I mean. So the amplitude is 1, which means we're up 1 at a maximum at the start. Okay? And then at the very end, at the end of our period, which in this case is 2 pi, we're also at a maximum. Alright, now, how the pattern works. So we're max to max, so that means in the middle of this interval, we're going to be at a minimum value. Okay, so max and max, and in the middle, we're at a minimum. And in between those 2 points, we're going to be on the midline. So it almost looks like you're making a V shape. You don't draw it as a V, but it looks like the points are making a V shape. And let's see here. Yeah, then we're just going to connect the points. Okay, so it's going to look like a different shape, but essentially it's the same kind of graph. There you go. And just draw arrows to signify you're going that infinitely, but there's your shape. Alright, and that's really just about it. Okay, so it's the same graph, but starting at a positive values at the maximums. And you're still plotting 5 points like you are with sine. It's always 5 points, start to end, and then we're good. Alright, let's try another example. Now here we got negative, so that negative is going to be important here in a second. We got negative 2 cosine 2 theta. Alright, let's identify our 3 numbers. Again, the amp is just a number in front of the cosine or sine value. In this case, it's just 2. Okay, we have a positive, or just 2 is our amp. Our midline is, well, it's not being shifted up any value, so it's just going to be 0. And in this case, our period, if we look at our b value, our period is just 2 pi divided by our b value 2, which is pi. Okay? So we're going to use those three numbers to help us graph this function. And we always start with the midline. So again, the midline's at 0. So I'm going to do my dotted line here at 0. Okay. And then what I'm going to do after graphing the midline is I'm going to start with my pattern. Okay, this is a cosine graph, which means I'm going to be starting at a max or min. Because it's negative at the front, that means it's flipped. So instead of starting at a maximum value, I'm starting at a minimum value at the very beginning. And that minimum value, because the amp is 2, is going to be down 2 from the origin. We're starting down 2 from the origin. All right, so remember that it's going to start at a minimum and it's going to end at a minimum. And because my period is the length of pi, it's going to start at a minimum at 0 and end at a minimum at pi. Okay? Nothing too bad there. And then we just remember the pattern. Okay? So it starts and ends at a minimum, which means in the middle it's going to be at a maximum. Okay? And in between those 2 points, it's going to be crossing our midline. Okay? And then we just connect them, and connect them with a smooth curve. Like, don't do like a V shape. That looks bad. Like, kind of curve it up, curve it. There you go. There you go. You know, there's your cosine graph. And again, only one period is required to be graphed. You don't got to. I mean, you can keep going if you want, but like, I prefer only one. All right. All right. Let's try another example. So we have 0.5 times cosine plus 2. All right, let's identify those values. So 0.5 is my amp. So I'm going to put 0.5 as my amp. And the 2 is a shift up. All right, the 2 is a shift up. And then my B value, since there's nothing in front of the theta there, it's just 1. My period is the basic 2 pi. Okay? All right, so we got our amp, our period, our midline. Let's go ahead and start by graphing our midline. So 1, 2, 3, through 2. All right, now this is cosine, which means we're going to be starting at a max or min, and because this is positive, that means we're going to be starting at a max. Okay, the amp is 0.5, so from the origin we are up 0.5. We are up 0.5, and because it's a cosine, we're going to start and end at the maximum. So 0.5 at 0, and then at 2 pi, the end of my period, we're also at 0.5. Okay. And remember the pattern is in between those, in the middle at pi here, we're going to be at 0.5 again as the amp at our minimum. Okay. And then again, in between those, at pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2, we are going to be crossing our midline. Okay. And then you just connect it. Here we go. Boom, boom, boom. Yay. Hopefully your dots actually connect. Mine did not. All right, how we feeling about this? Feeling good? Sweet. All right, then lastly, just like with sine graphs, you need to know how to be able to write the equation from either a graph or given information. Okay? So here it says write the cosine function with the following criteria. You got a period of pi, you got a midline of -4, and an amplitude of -2. Right? Technically, how you'll see amplitude, technically amplitude isn't really negative. Amplitude is always positive. It would normally say something like amplitude of 2 and flipped over x-axis. And that would give you the negative. Okay, so that's usually how you'll see it. Like on a final exam, that's how you'll see it there. Okay. All right, so let's go through this. Remember, my basic thing here is y equals a times cosine, we say b theta, and then plus our midline k. All right, so we got to figure out what a, b, and k are. Well, a and k, y'all are pretty good at just identifying that, right? The a value is just my amplitude, so this is a, and my midline is just my k value, which is -4. Okay. So in this case, it's going to be y equals -2 cosine, and I got to figure out what b is. Okay, b comes from the period. B comes from pi. It's not pi, but it comes from that. Remember how it works. B is equal to, or b is found by doing the period pi equal to 2 pi over b. Okay, pi equals 2 pi over b. And I'm running around the room here, so I'm going to kind of finish it right here. But how we solve that is to cross multiply, right? So I'm going to do pi times b equals 2 pi times 1. So that's b pi equals 2 pi. The pi's cancel out, and b equals 2. So in this case, b is 2, so that's 2 theta. And because the midline is negative 4, it's going to be minus 4. There is my answer. Okay. Amplitude and midline were explicitly given, and we had to solve for that b value. That's how it works every single time. And then lastly, the last problem that you know how to do is be able to look at a graph and write a cosine function from the graph. We did sine yesterday, we're doing cosine right now. Remember your general formula, okay? Y equals a cosine b theta, and then plus, like I said K last example, but I said yesterday it was D. It doesn't matter, just a vertical shift, okay? Okay, so we got to figure out the amplitude first, A. What does A equal? Well, remember, A is just the distance from your midline to your maximum or your minimum. So my midline's here, it looks like it's 0, and it's going to positive 2, and it's going to negative 2. Okay, so that must mean that my amplitude in this case is 2, the distance from the midline to the max. We got our B value and our D value. The D value, remember, is the midline, and it looks like the midline is directly here through the origin or at the x-axis. That's just going to be 0. And then my B value comes from the period. Okay, so how long, this is like, okay, I see that the whole graph that we're given is going from 0 all the way over to 2 pi. But we have the pattern occurring twice. Okay, so don't just say 2 pi because you see 2 pi on the axis. You got to ask yourself, what is the length of one period? And I always find the length of one period by looking from like minimum to minimum or maximum to maximum. And here, if you look at the beginning, we're starting at a minimum, and the distance to the next minimum is the length of pi. Okay, so period in this case is equal to pi. So what does that make b? Well, if my period is pi, that's equal to 2 pi over b. All right, and we actually already solved this in the last example. That ends up making b equal to 2 when we solve. Okay, so we got a equals 2, we got b equals 2, and d equals 0. Let's go ahead and graph it, or let's go ahead and write the equation. So that's y equals my a value 2 times cosine of b theta, so 2 theta, and then plus 0 because our midline is not shifted. All right, that's the equation, but remember the thing that happened yesterday. What is something else that I've got to notice with this graph? Where is it starting with? It's starting with a minimum. So that means it's flipped, which means it's going to be negative. Don't ever let me trick you with that. Okay, if it starts at a minimum, or if the sine graph is starting by going down, it's going to be a negative function. So there you go. You now know how to graph sine and cosine, and we will practice this a lot more on Tuesday, and we will be all set. Smiley face, video under 15 minutes. Life is good. Be nice to the sun. Okay.